starting the webinar. Hangout attendees are joining right now.
Mhm.
There are 118 registered this morning when I looked. So
Excellent.
yeah, they're popping in, and
Fantastic.
30.
Yeah, welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a minute here. We should have had some appropriate, maybe like 2001 Space Odyssey or fanfare or something playing in the background.
All right, looks like it's kind of leveled off here at 36, so I say go for it.
Okay,
So
excellent. Dr. Tepper.
okay. Thank you, and hello everyone, and welcome to this workshop on the emerging space cyber warfare theater and the need for governance responses. We have an excellent lineup of panelists in two panels moderated by experts on both outer space and cyber. This project or this workshop and the project in general is the result of a cooperation between the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, which is a leading Canadian think tank, Laval University of Quebec, Indiana University Bloomington, and the University of Mississippi. When I initially presented the issue to Aaron Schul, which is the managing director and general counsel of the CIGI, and this was in January 2021, this was more of a prediction to the future. I think that recent events have made it more real. We are going to have two panels, each is around 45 minutes. In the first panel, the panelists will discuss the emerging space cyber theater and its potential to become the primary battlefield for global powers in the 21st century, as well as the potential of the space cyber attacks to become a leading asymmetric means of targeting a space-based infrastructure by countries, criminal organizations, and terrorist groups. The first panel will be moderated by Scott Shackelford, which is a professor of business law and ethics at Indiana University Bloomington. He also serves as the chair of its cybersecurity program and as the executive director of the Ostrom workshop. He's also an affiliated scholar at both the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and also Stanford's Center for Internet and Society. He's also a team member at the Council of Foreign Relations and a senior fellow at the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research. There is more, but I will stop at that in the interest of time. So Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be with all of you here today. And just thank you, Dr. Tepper, did all of the heavy lifting to make this event come together. And frankly, to lead the Ostrom Workshop's space governance research portfolio, including the new Space Governance Policy Lab, which we'll be hearing a little bit more about. So couldn't be more thrilled about this really timely conversation. Unfortunately, all too timely these days. And thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I'm Scott Shackelford, as was mentioned, and we'll tell you a little bit more about the Ostrom Workshop as well as we go through here. You see it virtually behind me, but just know that you're all more than welcome in any of our working groups, including, if you're not already a member, the Space Governance Working Group. We also have working groups on critical infrastructure protection, cybersecurity, cyber peace, more of the international cyber norm efforts as well, depending on what your particular interests may be. And you can just go to ostromworkshop.indiana, to learn more, to sign up. We'll put up a link in just a few minutes here. But it's my honor to moderate our first panel of distinguished guests here on the moderating, in particular here at the Emerging Space Cyber Theater, where we're going to be focusing first and foremost on these emerging threats themselves. Whereas, as Dr. Chapter mentioned, panel 2 then will be focusing on what the heck do we do about them in terms of emerging norm opportunities, multilateral as well as domestic laws and policies. So let me introduce our distinguished panelists before we welcome some opening remarks from each, and we'll just do it in the order I have on the screen here. So first we have Dr. Jana Robinson, who is the managing director of the Prague Security Studies Institute, and she has been in that role since April 2020. She also serves as PSSI's Space Security Program Director, a post she assumed in 2015. And she previously held the position of Space Policy Officer at the European External Action Service in Brussels, as well as the Space Security Advisor to the Czech Foreign Ministry. So we couldn't be more thrilled to have you on the panel, Dr. Robinson. And then I'll just introduce all four, then we'll go back and we'll do opening remarks from each, if that's okay. Next, we have Brigadier General retired Robert Mazzelin, and apologies if I mispronounce anybody's names here, including yours, Robert, but Chief Technologist Officer at the RHEA Group. And in that role, he serves as the CTO for a while now, and this is an international company providing engineering solutions, systems development, and security services for space, military, government, and other critical infrastructure applications. He served a variety of key command and staff roles at all ranks before that. Notable appointments during his military service include responsibility for all Canadian Armed Forces and Department of National Defense Strategic Network, signals intelligence, electronic warfare, and cyber operations, strategic cyber policy development, and responsibility for the engineering and program management of the Canadian Army C4ISR, the command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems. And yes, there'll be a quiz at the end, so you have to remember that. So welcome, sir. We also have Aaron Miller, the Executive Director of the Space ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center. Aaron has over a decade of experience building meaningful tech collaborations and has formed hundreds of formal partnerships between government, industry, and academia to solve problems for warfighters and national security. Currently, Aaron is the Executive Director of the Space ISAC and leads this public-private partnership with fervor to secure the global space community. This is the third nonprofit launch Aaron has led and has been passionate about public-private partnerships for her entire career. Aaron also serves on the advisory board of the Cyber SatGov, Cyber LEO, and is a board member for the Colorado Springs Chamber of Commerce. And lastly, we have Richard Vandermeulen, Vice President of Space and Satellite Broadband at Viasat, very much in the news, unfortunately, lately, which we'll be talking about, a global broadband service and technology company. Viasat is the world's largest operator of GEO satellite communications capacity. Since 2010, he has led strategy and has been a thought leader at Viasat's efforts to serve government, commercial markets with best available broadband networks. He's also an avid proponent of space and satellite communications industry, and has been in a variety of other roles earlier in his career, including at Boeing and otherwise. So in other words, an all-star panel. I promise to keep the space puns to a minimum. And we couldn't be more excited to have all of you and feature your incredible backgrounds and expertise today as we grapple with this emerging nexus of space and cybersecurity, which unfortunately, as we'll be talking more about now, has been at the front lines, including of the ongoing war in Ukraine. But I'm wondering, just to help get us going, I'd welcome some opening remarks from each of you. And it can be on the overall theme, or if you'd like to, you could even consider what you feel to be some of the main cybersecurity risks, to both ground and satellite-based infrastructure that frankly just aren't getting the attention they deserve, from your different perspectives. So maybe, Jana, we could start with you with any general opening remarks, as well as any, response to that pretty overall broad opening question there.
Yes. Thank you, Scott. Thanks very much for your kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be here today to discuss this certainly important issue, as you indicated. I would probably attack it from the perspective that first I'll briefly introduce our institute and our work, and then link it perhaps to broader trends in space security, because I think that it will be useful not to stovepipe just cyber as one element, but once you dive into it, maybe the brief overview of the broader context might be helpful, including the ongoing war in Ukraine. So our institute, Prague Security Studies Institute, is a nonprofit, non-governmental public policy organization that was founded in 2002. So indeed, we celebrate our 20th anniversary this year. Our main mission is to help safeguard and strengthen the freedoms and democratic institutions of the nations in Central and Eastern Europe and globally. We offer several educational programs for graduate students and young professionals, including a master's degree program at Charles University in Prague, which we co-sponsor, as well as our annual NATO Summer School and Cybersecurity Academy. Our most prominent research and policy endeavors involve the emerging risks and threats to the Transatlantic Alliance and other partners globally in the economic and financial and outer space domains. We also conduct security-minded research concerning disinformation and the Western Balkans. So that's what we do, and perhaps I would start with the key trends in space security and follow with some implications of the ongoing war against Ukraine. With regard to the key trends, the space domain, there is generally more dependency, it is more commercial, and it is more diversified. So space-based services have become an integral part of life in the most of the developed world, as we well know. Moreover, we're clearly witnessing a rapid increase in commercial capabilities, and a growing number of nations are seeking to acquire space-derived benefits and indigenous capabilities for both civil and military uses. It's been indicated that there are currently at least 82 countries with at least one satellite in orbit, and that the government space sector spending in 2021 globally increased by 50% since 2015. This dynamic environment has created opportunities for new international partnerships, networking opportunities within the space industry, but also pressing security challenges. Although those that follow the space portfolio have seen that a lot of political attention has recently been given to the destructive anti-satellite capabilities, the gray zone spectrum of threats is worrisome, as there are no accepted deterrence regimes currently in place to address these low intensity hostile activities. With regard to the implications of the conflict in Ukraine, I think that the critical issues that stand out here are the overly ambitious scale of Russia's military aggression, the indispensability of space assets in the conflict, and the use of the economic and financial tools by the West for both penalties as well as deterrence. It's important to see the gray zone activities in the broader context. We've experienced GPS jamming by Russian forces even prior to the invasion in November 2021. Similar tactics were used back in 2014 prior to the invasion of Crimea as well. Since the commencement of hostilities, we've witnessed a multifaceted cyber attacks against Viasat satellite modems in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe, and Russia's jamming of Starlink services. Added to this, we have heard responsible and menacing statements by Dmitry Rogozin, the head of Roscosmos, and the abrupt halt to Moscow's space collaboration with the West, together with Western sanctions against Russian companies. So the overall outcome is a major and frankly unwelcome shift in space diplomacy, predictability, and global commercial and governmental cooperation. So the private sector has had a significant role to play in shaping the conflict on the ground and will only grow in significance in the post-war space environment as products and services offered by commercial space companies such as Maxar or Hawkeye 360 are especially relevant to military planning and execution, as well as documenting deliberate attacks on the civilian population. The conflict in Ukraine reminded us that although cyber attacks are not a new phenomenon, they now put at greater risk space-derived benefits from civil and commercial assets, while an adversary secures an asymmetric advantage. So the policy challenge again here is effective deterrence. The US and its allies, for example, haven't been really able to dissuade China and Russia from engaging in irresponsible behavior or malevolent behavior, including ASAT testing in the vicinity of GEO, hacking into NASA's computer systems. And we haven't really been able to hold them accountable after such a hybrid disruption or an attack. It is likely that these threats to space operations will continue to grow as the asymmetric effects are embraced by China and Russia as additional means to expand their global influence and control. And finally, we have few policy guidelines concerning how the allies can take action against gray zone operations and how to reflect them in broader security architectures. So I think I will stop here, and I look forward to the subsequent discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson. That was brilliant and touched on a lot of themes that I was hoping we would get to throughout this panel. So you did such a wonderful job of laying out the landscape. And I'm sure that many of these points will be picked up on, including by Dr. Maslin, Chief Technology Strategist at the REA Group. So Dr. Maslin, we welcome your opening remarks as well as any reflections on that opening question of perhaps any underappreciated aspects to the cyber risk facing space-based and ground-based infrastructure.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to participate with such a distinguished group of speakers, and compliment Dr. Robinson for a wonderful synopsis of the of key issues. Perhaps just a very, very brief intro about our company, because it more in the context of basically our strategic objectives and how they align to one of the key themes that I'd like to speak to. So the REA Group, we're involved in providing secure engineering solutions in both the space and the cyber domains. And key clients are the European Space Agency and the European Union Agency for the Space Program. So supporting the broad range of geospatial capabilities, Earth observation communications, and certainly the Galileo program, and supporting institutional clients like the European Union in large part. The key issue here really is looking at if there's some major functional themes. It's the issue of space and cyber. What we're seeing them as they've been declared as new domains of conflict or strategic struggle. And what we see is we look at nation state societal resiliency, government legitimacy that's dependent in large part on critical infrastructure that now is virtually touched in every manner by either cyber and space capabilities. Historically, one of the other elements contributing to this is when we start looking at governments that are increasingly using commercial assets in support of providing critical services that ostensibly support societal resiliency. We're seeing an increasing emphasis on the use of the new space environment. And historically, when we look at the old space environment, there were more traditional players, which were largely government-led, select industry, and providing bespoke capabilities in selected areas. perhaps a bit more secure in some regards. But we see now with a new commercial emphasis on new space, emphasis on commercial technologies and industries that really are more akin to a high-tech mindset of fielding very quickly, very fast, and innovative capabilities with at low cost, if you will. The question then arises as the extent to which these capabilities are in fact secure, if you will. So it brings up a number of different risks, and the risks are to infrastructure. We see a movement, whereas many of the historically terrestrial-based capabilities have migrated into the space-based environments with the launch over the next 10 years of an anticipated 25,000 satellites that will provide the broad spectrum of services from EO, comms, and precision navigation and timing. What we'll see is a broader demographic of companies being exposed, a broader demographic of industry capability in the supplying threats, as well as the connectivity and increasingly exploding network technology. We look at the evolution of 6G technologies, Internet of Things, which will be connected through this complex infrastructure. Ostensibly, it requires a different approach to thinking when it regards to new policies, programs, and approaches to the defensive capabilities. The historically perimeter-based security processes are no longer valid in this environment. We start looking at more artificial intelligence, defensive automated defense systems to protect these types of infrastructure. So in large part, and as well, different protocols internationally in terms of how we put these models in place so these services are available for a broader user dynamic. So a quick synopsis there from my thinking.
Absolutely. No, and that was so incredibly helpful, Robert. I hadn't heard that stat before of 25,000 satellites upcoming. So my goodness, that really underscores the stakes. So thank you so much. Extremely helpful. So we'll just continue with our opening remarks with two more distinguished panelists here. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A as well. Next up, Erin Miller, the Executive Director of the Space ISAC. Erin, we're welcome.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here. I'm going to take a similar approach here and just share with you a little bit about my organization. And I think that will naturally pave the way into the discussion about current trends. So, Space ISAC is an ISAC. So I don't assume that everyone knows what an ISAC is. It's a public-private partnership where we share threats and vulnerabilities for the space community. And we stood up this organization back in 2019. It was stood up actually because of the problem set that we're currently facing today, and we have been for some time, which is that, as the general indicated, that we have historically been really government focused with our spending associated with the development of space systems, and now we're leaning towards a much more commercially dominated community. And so we need to be able to share information between those government sources and the commercial sector, and also be extremely internationally oriented in that information sharing. So Space ISAC exists to serve this purpose of breaking down the silos of public and private sector sharing, in particular related to cybersecurity threats, but we're also focused on other threats and hazards, not just cybersecurity. And part of the reason why is that the definition of cybersecurity can sometimes seem narrow, and it may be interpreted too narrowly for the space community because it's such a hazardous environment up there in space. It's very different dynamics. You can't exclude the physical when you're having the conversation about cybersecurity. So our public and private sector model is intended to facilitate collaboration across the global space community and enhance our ability to prepare for and respond to vulnerabilities, incidents, and threats. We're disseminating timely and actionable information among all of our members. We're a membership-based organization, and we serve as the primary communications channel for the space sector. There are other ISACs that have been stood up by the White House and by the private sector in the US, like the automotive ISAC, the water ISAC, electricity ISAC. There's one for every critical infrastructure. And so space is adding to that list. There's about 30 of them. And we intend to be incredibly operational. So our primary focus right now is to stand up a watch center that will share these threats and vulnerabilities information. We do issue alerts today, and we're building on that capability. So we hope to have our initial operating capability for our watch center. And we are already observing trends as we're seeing the activities that are happening right now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then more open source information that's being made available. There's definitely trends that are showing the availability of the information about the cyber attacks that are occurring. And so this is the main problem that I see that we face, is that we need a place to share this information, and we need a place where the commercial sector and the international community can come together to be able to gain access to this information in a trusted manner. So that's why we're standing up our watch center in order to do that. The reasons why have been addressed by some of our already, great speakers and incredibly respected individuals in this area. So I appreciate your insights, and just wanted to build on that with my commentary, my opening commentary. So I think I'll close there.
Thank you so much, Aaron. That's very, very helpful. And I hadn't heard that stat either about the 30, total ISACs. Now you often hear the 16 sectors plus a couple more, but I didn't realize it was almost double that at this point. Like, if I may, just kind of moderator's privilege, right? One quick nerdy question for you, and that is, why a space ISAC instead of a space ISAO, right? Which was a movement under, I think, the Obama administration to create these broader information sharing organizations that weren't so sector specific. And since, as Robert was saying, space touches on so many sectors and is going to be doing even more, do you feel like that construct is too limiting as you try to build out more of this capacity, maybe even a joint security operations center down the road? Or do you feel like that's just, this is the best way to go about it? I'm sure you've thought a lot about that.
Yeah, I think the ISAO model is intended to be extremely horizontal in nature and focus on, so you could take like a lens like small business, and you could say, we're going to address the needs of every single cybersecurity needs of every single small business. Where we're taking more of a vertical approach, and we're saying that space systems are critical infrastructure. Every single other designated critical infrastructure, you're looking at DHS's designation of critical infrastructures in the US, then those are being touched by space systems. There's a dependency for those critical infrastructures to use space systems in order to perform their services. However, if you divide space systems up 16 different ways, then it's never a priority. And so using the ISAC model, then it's a vertical that's 100% focused on space systems. So we wake up every day thinking about the cybersecurity and other security elements of all space systems. So not just payloads and not just the government assets, although we are concerned, and our partnerships with the government and making sure that there's bidirectional sharing there, but also the expanding new space and commercial, the vast commercial interests in exploring space and utilizing space for commercial services.
For sure. Thank you. That was extremely helpful. I appreciate it. Excellent. Okay. And now last but certainly not least, we have Richard Vanderbilt, Vice President of Space and Satellite Broadband at Viasat. And Richard, my guess is some folks on the call might be familiar with what's been happening, especially since February forward. But as part of your opening remarks, if you'd like to just give a quick overview, Jana already started with some of this about kind of what's been happening with your organization, the confluence with the war in Ukraine. That might be kind of a useful starting point too, if you're able. I'm sure some of it you can't go in too much depth.
Well, so thank you, Scott. Thanks, everybody. So clearly our observations in this are not classified. What becomes sensitive, what you're alluding to, what becomes sensitive is when you inform the government of your observations, and they go into the process of trying to understand the vulnerabilities or work to determine maybe who was the cause or the source. So that's where things get a lot more sensitive. But I'd really like to get to the questions. So let me kind of just open with a couple quick thoughts. One, and this gets to the topic today. We're an internet service provider. We wouldn't say space. You know, the fact that satellites are involved in our distribution media is maybe required for some of the customers that we serve, but we're an internet service provider. And what went on in this activity, which the Secretary of State has attributed to a state actor, what went on in this was a purposeful effort to deny service. So when you talk about states, criminal organizations, terrorist groups, one opening thought might be that from an attack perspective, their goals could be significantly different. In that maybe a criminal organization wouldn't be looking so much for an outage, where a state actor might. So let me just kind of throw that out there. That's it.
Well said. Oh, please go ahead.
No,
That was great. Okay.
I want to get to the questions.
Absolutely. No, the fun stuff. That was provocative, and I really, really appreciate that. Excellent. Okay, so let us then move on and talk a little bit, again, like I said in the chat there and at the beginning, I have a few questions I was hoping to pose to our distinguished panelists. I'd also encourage the panelists to think, we try to limit crosstalk, but you're all extraordinarily well-versed in all these issues. So if there's issues you'd like to bring up and kind of get reflections on, that's great as well. And I already see at least one, in the Q&A, feel free to have those kind of populate, and we'll turn to those in about, 5 or so minutes, so that we have at least 10 minutes for broader question and answer as well. So maybe let's focus just for a moment on the war in Ukraine itself, and how it has exposed, some vulnerabilities in both space-based infrastructure as well as ground-based. And I'm wondering if there's been any particular surprises in that regard for any of you, or maybe, frankly, the technical debt that we've all known about that plays out in a lot of ways, here on Earth is also, unfortunately, all too apparent up in orbit. And I'm wondering, as you kind of reflect on the implications that are still, just starting to be teased out of the ongoing war in Ukraine, whether or not you feel like we're doing enough in thinking about addressing not only the technical debt that's already, established, but also this is a hot topic in cyber norms discussions in terms of cybersecurity due diligence, right? I was in Talon for SciCon a week ago, and this was, I was on one of these, things with Mike Schmidt, and he was talking about how cybersecurity due diligence evolved a lot from Talon 1.0 to 2.0, really hot topic for Talon 3.0. And I'm wondering if you could give any thoughts to how you see that idea, of cybersecurity due diligence crystallizing, how that's being operationalized going forward with new launches, these 25,000 satellites, right, for example, that are going to be going up in due course. So maybe we'll just kind of take reverse order. And Robert, any reactions to any of those? I'm sorry, no, Richard, I got that backward. Richard, any reactions to any of those provocations there?
Well, okay, so I think one of the most interesting things about this is, and people may be familiar with this terminology, but this was a phase 2 attack, so and I'm using US military terminology where phase 0 would be peaceful and phase 1 would be, where you're starting escalation, but phase 2 is armed conflict. So this was an attack in armed conflict. So that I think makes it an interesting new case to study, because you're willing to, the attack tactics could be much more escalatory in in armed conflict than they would be in phase 0 or phase 1. So I think that is it just makes the problem very interesting. And then maybe the other thing that came out of this is that there's always been speculation that a state actor might attack a commercial system, but they mostly are attacking military systems, or at least the military tends to think of it that way. But this is a case where they attacked a commercial system. They attacked a commercial system because they were targeting some of the people that were on the network. But more importantly, they attacked it without regard to civil or consumer damage that was outside of the Ukraine
Mhm.
region.
Mhm.
You know, so they didn't
Mhm.
care.
Yeah.
I think that's the interesting part.
Mhm. Oh, it certainly is. It certainly is, Richard. My goodness. Yeah. Yeah. And you kind of, you're underscoring there very nicely that fact that, you know, no nation is an island in cyberspace, no matter how much, you know, some wish they were sometimes. And also as we rely more and more on space-based infrastructure, what happens perhaps in one region of the planet with one focus can quickly spread out, even when you're trying to have proportionality, which I agree. I don't think that was apparent at all in this case. And you're bringing so many other aspects to light too, including, you know, human rights issues. But no, please go ahead.
Right. No, and even one of the questions that's in the chat is
Yeah.
you know, so how do you add resilience? You know,
Mhm.
all right. So in a phase 0 or phase 1 sense, the attack might not have been as severe, but this attack was, you know, okay. So if you're the attacker, how are you going to go home and say I failed in my mission?
Yeah.
So how far would they have continued to escalate? You know, if let's say if our defenses were up higher, how far further would they have escalated in order to get their effect? And would they have gone beyond cyber and into other domains? You know, because from a military standpoint, they're going for the effect, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, the question of how do you have resilience? You have to have resilience not only in the network that you're using, you have to have resilience in maybe having multiple paths to operate in. You know, so you know, deterrence is created 2 ways. Deterrence is created by punishment. So essentially make imposing costs on the adversary so that they have to be prepared to attack multiple networks simultaneously. And deterrence is created by denying benefit. You know, if in the case here is, if you know you can attack one network, you now have to know you can attack multiple networks simultaneously and succeed. So the kind of the resilience question is resilience has to come in depth.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Richard. Very well said. And we have another, well, a whole number now of really interesting questions that relate to this. So I'm wondering, maybe, Aaron, you know, feel free to reflect on this resilience point, or anything with regard to the role of Space ISAC, you know, so far in the ongoing war in Ukraine, you know, but also, as Jessica brought up, just frankly, some of the challenges that you've run into with information sharing, you know, in this context.
Sure. Yeah. So of course, information sharing requires trust in a community. So that's always a hot topic. That we're building the space community right now, the community that will engage with Space ISAC Watch Center. And so our approach is to ask different member companies, and in particular, those who are owners of space assets, what are their priority interest areas? What are the threat scenarios that they see unfolding that they need information about now? And so we're building our Watch Center based on the notion that the members of the space community, you know, like Richard's been talking about here, they are experiencing these challenges firsthand. And so they need a place to go to share that information. And that's what's going to build the trust in the community. And creating domain awareness in space. One of the ways that we can do that is by giving owner operators more visibility on what's going on and what maneuvers are taking place, and when interference is taking place. So that's 2 of our highest priority areas right now, is to provide that information directly to asset owners on a regular basis.
Very well said, Aaron. Yeah, there's this famous, you know, tripartite structure that Eleanor Ostrom, who founded the workshop, is known for. And that's, you know, at the base level, you have to have communication before you can get to coordination. And then finally, as you were saying, you know, confidence building measures, trust, ultimately, which, as she said, was the most important resource. And it's in short supply these days. I think that's fair to say. So thank you so much, Aaron. Really, really helpful. And then Robert as well, please. There's a number of points I feel like you can pick up on here, whether it's more related to building resilience coming out, hopefully one day of the war in Ukraine, but just applying some of the lessons we're getting from already. But also feel free if you see any other questions that are related to this in the chat that you'd like to respond to, that's completely fine. We'll turn to Richard's, which is more specific there in just a little bit. But I think zero trust is also relevant as we talk about resilience. So, feel free to reference that if you'd like to as well. So Robert, any reactions so far?
Yes, thanks. Apologies, I was just muted.
Oh, no, you're okay.
A wide range of points, if you will, and again, perhaps you'll kind of focus maybe in a little bit more on the first couple of questions in terms of kind of the resiliency of the infrastructure, as well as particular lessons that are learning in terms of the Russian attack on the Ukraine. When we start looking again, what we see, what has happened in the Ukraine, what we see is the playing out of a hybrid multispectral attack on a nation that encompasses the broad range of capabilities. So we've seen, a cyber-based capabilities, and certainly the Ukrainians were probably better prepared as a result of the 2015 attacks on the electrical grid. So from a cyber perspective, they've defended themselves quite diligently. When we take a look at the space segment, again, some of the weaknesses that come about as a result of reliance on commercial capabilities start to play out. And although a lot of when you talk about zero trust strategies with respect to protecting space-based cyber infrastructure that's associated ground segment and aboard platforms, what we start to see is that there are some peculiarities or specific nature of the space environment that makes it susceptible to further challenges. So when you start looking at kinetic physical attacks against space-based assets, non-kinetic physical attacks such as directed energy weapons, electromagnetic pulse, and such, electronic warfare capabilities, as you see that the Russians have deployed the Lear-34 system to jam against the Galileo and GPS systems, and then of course the cyber attacks that are against specific platforms, space-based platforms, as well as ground-based space platforms. So when we see nations that actually have deployed such capability, from the range from jamming and spoofing, from the Lear-34 capabilities, or anti-satellite testing that has been done as a result of the Noodle launches in the past. You see a state that's able to conduct across a spectrum of capabilities, not only from a space-based, but also from a kinetic. They've employed hypersonic missiles along with kinetic capabilities, and they've done that in partnership with an informationalized campaign from a cyber perspective to control the agenda. And that really speaks to the application of cyber and space capabilities to provide a capability that functions below the threshold of armed conflict and response, but provides a calibrated escalation means in terms of being to assert influence and be able to try to temper the nature of the effect, not only within the host nation, but in the nation that's being attacked. So a number of points there. I mean, we get into a lot of specifics with respect to how do you protect infrastructure. That tends to get into a very much more technical discussion, if you will. I'll pause it there, though.
Really, really well done, Robert. And as we said, we're going to get to as many of these questions as possible. And of course, the nice thing about this format is at least if our panelists are willing, they can also, type some answers to these after the first panel concludes, any that we don't get to. But Jana, please feel free to pick up on any points, that you've heard so far. And also, if you'd like to bring, the EU and the ESA more directly into the conversation in terms of how you feel like, how effective those institutions have been at promoting, the resilience of space-based infrastructure, in this case, particularly from cyber attacks. I think that could be a really useful addition here too.
Yes, thanks very much. I'm sure that Jerome Mazzoli is probably more equipped right now to talk about the EAS and the Commission, what they're doing right now. But generally, there has been really a much greater attention to space risks and threats than at the time when I was serving there. So that's the good news, I think. I will say that, you know, our institute, we looked at back in 2018 at what do we encompass into the term space hybrid operations, and you know, we have concluded that they share various of these hybrid operations, including through the cyber domain, that they often involve. They cannot always be attributed, obviously, that has been mentioned. They're temporary and reversible. Also, for policymaking, what is important, they're not generally visible publicly. So the Ukraine conflict really put it out in the light much more. And what is also important, that what we have emphasized, is that they are designed to exploit the links to other domains, and that they're conducted just below the threshold of any requiring any meaningful response. So either military or political. So that complicates it. And I think that the fact that they're temporary and reversible, what do we do about attribution? What do we do about verification? Comes then to the problem of how do we enforce any norms that will be that will be configured, and the panelists on the next panel will discuss that. And an important piece, or yes, resilience, that is critical as well. But we also need to understand the escalatory potential. How does that work? Since, you know, we have great asymmetry of vulnerabilities and effects, and as well, you know, really in the open source, lack of high profile precedents. So how do we go about configuring and understanding any kind of escalatory potential? Also, oftentimes, you know, it's a number of events. It should be thought of as a number of events, not rather than a single incident, which, you know, the ultimate goal is to, I think, probe the gaps in preparedness, readiness, as well as coordination among partners or allies that are available. So I think that, you know, these are some of the thoughts that I would have to summarize the discussion that was done by the previous speakers. But also, I think one important piece, deterrence. I think that no matter how resilient we're going to build the infrastructures, you know, we need to think about deterrence and how do we properly dissuade you know, any potential attacker from doing what they're doing. And in here, it's been emphasized many times, but we're not looking to do it from space. You know, obviously, cross-domain options are here the bottom line. So our institute, for example, has focused on the economic and financial domain as a potential domain to impose penalties. And, you know, in that context, I will just briefly mention that there are currently already a number of companies that are sanctioned by the United States or the allies, including, for example, Japan for cyber attacks. So we already have some kind of bottom lines for building on that kind of deterrence structure. And we need to really think about more closely in how do we go about that down the road.
Thank you so much, Jana. Yeah, we're, as you can tell in a panel like this, especially with such knowledgeable panelists, but we're barely able to scratch the surface, especially given our time constraints on so many of these topics. We only have a few minutes left for this first panel, so I'm wondering, we'll maybe do one quick lightning round of some summary thoughts. Including, there's been a lot of great questions in the Q&A about some hot topics like the role of AI, you know, for example. You know, IoT was brought up earlier, kind of in the smart cities context, perhaps. Even quantum cryptography. There's so much in terms of space-based applications that are both cause for concern, but frankly, also maybe some opportunities to help us get a better handle on some of these cybersecurity challenges. So maybe we'll just do one last quick round. We'll try to limit it to just, quick 30 seconds, a minute reactions here. But Jana, to you first, any reflections on these hot topics that are coming up so much in the cybersecurity context here as applied to space, such as AI, right? Do you feel like that we're in place, in position to really take hold of some of the opportunities there to both better protect, space-based infrastructure with the help of AI, but also defend against, frankly, AI, based attacks?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that the other colleagues on the panel are much more equipped to discuss the technical aspects of these issues, but obviously the technology is evolving immensely quickly. And I think that our issue is how do we configure policies in a way that's catching up with the reality of today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is our main challenge, because a lot of the issues can be at the end solved technically. Like we saw it, for example, with the jamming of Eutelsat, right, back a few years back. I mean, we have had a lot of rounds of political discussions in terms of how to stop that, and at the end, I believe that some technical solution was found. So we always should rely on the technology to provide us with a solution. But if we can't, what kind of policies do we have?
Mm-hmm. Very, very good point, which is why the private sector plays such a key role here. And we'll turn, of course, as you said, to the norms discussion in the next panel. But first, to you, Robert, how well do you feel like the private sector is positioning itself with regards to codes of conduct, with actually deploying, realizing some of the benefits, guarding against the challenges of some of these new hot topics like AI in this context?
I'm sorry.
No, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so regrettably, I'm not sure that the private sector, from a service perspective, is positioning itself. I mean, it's still very early days, and there's tremendous economic opportunity. So you're seeing a lot of the new SAT companies. Also there's just a different culture in the new space environment, more akin to the high tech, deliver quickly, break things and learn type of environment. So some caution needs to be instilled there. But perhaps I can reflect on some of the work, for example, that we're doing with the European Space Agency and USPA, that's representative of a culture where you're starting to look at governments or institutions serving as catalysts for, I would say, gently regulating an environment that has a fundamental import to the provision of critical services to support societal resiliency. So what we're seeing is a lot of work, policy frameworks starting to develop in that construct, bringing together like-minded nations to actually shape the discussion. There's a number of work that's coming out of the United Nations group, and I won't speak to the next panel's efforts, but things that also bringing together communities of practice, such as like the ISAC, if you will, where you're bringing commercial players together. You're starting to look at the technical connection to the cyber threats and vulnerabilities, tailoring of existing standards that's applied to the traditional IT environment, but doing so against the specific threats and cyber-based vulnerabilities that you see in space. So tailoring of the NIST standards or the MITRE attack frameworks and such. And then finally, education and training. A lot of this really speaks to executives in large institutions that are responsible for critical infrastructure aren't necessarily cognizant of the dependence that they have on space-based assets or cyberspace assets. So it's actually working through that. So a lot of the work that we end up doing is setting up cyber centers of excellence to educate and train, developing the technologies, tailoring the technology developed such that it's actually fit for function, engaging with industry, if you will, to prize them of these actual threats so that they can start to consider these to a greater extent.
Excellent. Very well said, Robert. Thank you. And that brings to light this whole idea of, polycentricity and polycentric governance. How do you get a lot of different disparate groups working together on a similar topic? And that's kind of part and parcel of what we've been grappling with as well. And I think you're seeing a lot of great examples of that here. We're a little over time, but Aaron, and then finally Richard. Aaron first. Any final thoughts, reactions based on what you've heard, including with regards to some of these hot topics? I'm sure those have been topics of conversation at the Space ISAC.
Yes, we established an artificial intelligence and machine learning community of interest during the past 6 months. And in that group, they've recognized that artificial intelligence and machine learning is the source of cyber attacks against space systems. So that's something that we're looking at and intend to include it in the scope of our watch center as that begins to open. And then we also consider space systems to be, highly integral in the term smart cities and the smart cities constructs, because the energy grid and financial transactions are already using space systems. Individuals who operate in those cities and in their smart homes, they're already connected to space systems. So I think we need to think of it as a highly interconnected environment with a very large attack surface, and become more aware of the cybersecurity threats that face space systems and how that might impact all of the different other critical infrastructure sectors.
Mhm. Excellent. Thank you so much, Erin. That was brilliantly done. And then finally, Richard, any other closing thoughts from your perspective, including one idea that was, or one question rather, in the chat of what's one thing, right, that the federal government, for example, in the States or the European Commission, you pick the legal entity, could do, right, to get a better handle on this problem to aid the private sector here. Any thoughts?
So maybe the one thing, and this is maybe a new thing, it hasn't been in the chat, but our RMF, NIST, Zero Trust, AI, CISAs, Shields Up, all those are effective methods to increase the difficulty of, for the adversary. The new thing is, once the attack has occurred, once this determined attacker has attacked, characterizing the threat classes immediately is very important. Essentially releasing new mitigations into your network to counter them is very important. And doing that in an expedited change control process is important. And so like the one thing the government shouldn't do is slow down the change process for installing, mitigations, because what we've seen here is a determined attacker is going to continue to knock on that door until they get their accomplishment. So I think we talk a lot about Zero Trust and AI and Shields Up and all these things, but we're not talking about how we speed the recovery process. That's the new thought. Thanks.
A wonderful one to end on. So thank you so much. And please join me, everybody, in thanking our distinguished panelists. Absolutely brilliant discussion. We could have had another hour and still barely scratched the surface, I think, but thank you all. We so appreciate it. And if you're willing or able, I'm sure you have a lot of other commitments to get to, but if there's any particular questions you'd like to answer, you can just, type obviously in there as well. And thanks to all of the great questions from the audience. Dr. Tepper, I know we're a few minutes over here, but over to you. I think you wanted to provide some updates and some thoughts about some of the space governance work going on at Ostrom and otherwise before we turn to our second panel. And what do we do about all these challenges that we just laid out? Thank you.
So thank you, Scott, and the panelists for an interesting and eye-opening discussion. We shared before the link to the Ostrom workshop space governance program, and we invite you to visit the link and you consider the various research projects that we have. This is one of those projects, and the other activities that we have. We have an ongoing working group that meets during the academic year once a month. We will have a speaker series, a course that we will a course about space governance, and we also work together with others on the funding opportunities. So please visit the website, the webpage, and if you have any questions or would like to participate in any of the activities, you're welcome to write to me or to Scott. This workshop also marks the launch of the space cyber governance project. This is a 2-year project that aims to suggest governance responses to the challenge of the space cyber security. The same challenge that the first panel discussed. In particular, the project aims to identify principles for responsible space cyber behavior that will represent a broad international consensus. For this project, we bring together a cohort of scholars, experts, and practitioners from around the world in a group of experts that will discuss governance responses and also work to identify shared norms. And I would like to invite you, the participants of this workshop, to join the group of experts. For this purpose, you may contact myself or Scott or Charles. The group of experts will hold several meetings or webinars, and the secretariat of the group will prepare the meetings and also follow up by adapting the discussions to proposals. The final meeting will be held in person in Washington, D.C., where the group of experts will hopefully adopt a document of principles for responsible space cyber behavior. The second panel that we will have now opens the discussions on governance responses, a discussion that will later continue within the group of experts. This panel discusses the possibility of adopting integrated rules on responsible space cyber behavior. As we know, or as we might discuss now, the governance of the emerging space cyber theater is a split into two channels. One is on space and the other is on a cyber. And this split is also in the work of UN organs like the Committee on Disarmament, UNODA, and the various groups of governmental experts that the UN convenes. The split also occurs with the manuals. We have the Tallinn manuals and the Milamos and the Woomera that are separate in terms of outer space and the cyber. The panelists in the next panel will discuss the possibility and the desirability of an integrated discussion and the identification of a principle for responsible space cyber behavior that build on the above, but focus on the space cyber domain. The panel will be moderated by Charles Stotler, which is co-director of the LLM program in Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi, where he also teaches courses on air and space law, as well as on cyber law, and the supervisor thesis writing by students on those topics. So Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eitan, and thank you, Scott. We're extremely happy to participate in this event and in this project. I'm going to hurry through any introduction so as to give my panelists as much time as possible. We're going to start with a broader view on theory, with a presentation or discussion of space power theory and cyber power theory, how they are similar, how they are different. And then we're going to hear a little bit about current ongoing efforts at the UN level, as well as other transnational forums of civil society, such as manuals, to try to identify currently what's being done. And then we'll hear a little bit, I think, about attribution, difficulties with attribution, and challenges of applying space law and general international law to cyber issues. And so that's all of that in hopes of identifying the propriety and ability, I think, to breaking down these silos at the international level, and also to perhaps start to form some ideas about what principles of responsible behavior might look like. And so I'll introduce each panelist just before their intervention, and then hopefully we'll have a good amount of time left for some Q&A at the end, where we can get into what these principles of responsible behavior might look like. We're going to start with Brent Zarnak, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Space Power at the Air Command and Staff College, Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. He teaches military theory and space power strategy to U.S. Air Force and Space Force mid-career officials. He is also a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force Reserve, assigned to the Air Force Cyber College, where he studies the nexus between space and cyber power. He's a prolific writer, holds a master's degree in space systems engineering and doctorates in economics and military strategy. And with that, I will turn it over to Brent.
Well, hey, thanks for that. And thanks everybody for showing up to listen and letting me speak. I'll try to be fast, because the last thing you probably want to hear is a lecture from a stale academic. But when we were asked to do this panel about trying to find integrated rules on responsible space and cyber behavior, it really struck me that we need to try to figure out, if we're going to have integrated rules, we have to figure out what the overlap between space and cyber is. And as a 20-year space officer in the in the U.S. Air Force, I've heard all my life that it was, space is just cyber power, and they're linked and all this other kind of things. And being a guy that grew up on too much Star Trek and too much, or focusing my early studies on advanced propulsion, I was like, cyber is nothing compared to as cool as space power is. But after I calmed down a little bit and had to actually research this as an academic, I just wanted to bring up a couple of different things. And most of these are quotes from books that I think are fairly important. And the first one that I'll say is from it's got a very ominous cover, but it's called Space Strategy by a French Air Force officer named Jean-Luc Lefebvre. He wrote a couple of years ago. And he posits that in the 21st century, only an infocracy can rule the world. And to become an infocracy, it is necessary already to be a spaciocracy. And if such a thing exists, it will have a similar strengths and weaknesses to a thalassocracy. Now, as a California public school student, I have no idea what a lot of those words were. But basically what he's saying that is, an information power is the most important type of power in the 21st century. But in order to be an information power, you have to first be a space power. And if you're going to act as a proper space power, it's going to act an awful lot like a maritime power in history. And I think that's, I was floored when I first read that, because it gives us a lot of insight into the overlap. And the overlap between information power, and I would call cyber power at least another maybe subset of information power, is that space and cyber are important together because of their contributions to information. And the information that comes from being a space power or a cyber power is really enabled through a classic military term, a naval term called lines of communication. And, if we were going to have an integrated rule set on space and cyber, it will probably focus on the lines of communication through, or for information lines of communication through space and cyber avenues. And this is sort of important because in space warfare, lines of communication is somewhat important. And if we assume that Lefebvre's onto something, if we move on to another book called Space Warfare by a naval officer named John Klein, he argues that the inherent value of space is the utility and access it provides. And this utility and access are enabled through what he calls celestial lines of communication. The lines of communication in and through space used for the movement of trade, material, supplies, spacecraft, and electromagnetic transmissions. And I would add that he says he includes data as well. So everything has to flow for both cyber and space to influence and be useful to the public that they're supposed to serve. There's physical activities in space that are sort of unique to cyber. The Apollo space program was not really a cyber power thing, although it had a little computer in it. So it's significantly, it's different than just cyber power. On the flip side, if someone's talking about a new operating system, even though that operating system can be used in space, it's not necessarily, Windows 14 or 15 or whatever we're on now is not necessarily space power. And if we're going to come up with integrated rules, we have to sort of appreciate those differences. But we also have to realize that the overlap between space and cyber could be very substantial, maybe even 80, 90% the way that they are now. And then ultimately, I really enjoyed hearing the first people talk because it was a very interesting practical applications of some of the things that I deal with in theory. And the last thing that I would really want to say is that if we assume that information is important and the lines of communication in space can be, non-physical, essentially electromagnetic, waves and other things that data can flow through. Klein has a very interesting thing to say about space warfare. And he says, the primary objective of space warfare is to protect and defend one's own lines of communication while limiting the ability of the adversary to use his. So I would really like to stress to this community that Klein might very well be right in that space warfare in its legitimate form is to protect, defend, and attack lines of communication that right now deal mostly with data and information, as we've heard. There's GPS jamming, there's jamming of communication satellites, there's attacks on data networks through cyber activity. And this is the kind of warfare that space and cyber are probably going to have to deal with for the foreseeable future. And I think that's sort of important for a couple of different reasons. One is that if we're going to start to discuss about what responsible behavior is in the space and cyber realms, we might have to at least acknowledge that if you're attacking or defending your lines of communication, especially with regards to data, that might very well be a legitimate use of military force. It might be a legitimate and responsible use of your military, space, and cyber power to try to attack and defend one's lines of communication, as long as you do it while limiting the amount of damage that could potentially be done to the societies that require that data in order to function at their highest levels. Personally, I would rather get shots taken at satellites as a space guy because you're not taking shots at people. That being the case, there's very bad things that can be done if you cause too much havoc, even on space or cyber systems. So while I would say that maybe reversible activities are very good, and legitimate uses of force, they might not be, a happy occasion, but war is never happy, but they might at least be legitimate. But then we can also start to see what illegitimate uses of cyber and space forces are too, like attacking terrestrial targets from space, which some people have argued is what you need to have in order to have a space power worth anything, or a cyber attack that can bring down an entire nation's infrastructure, whether it can happen or not. But I think if we're going to have integrated rules on responsible space and cyber behavior, we have to find their common denominator. And I would say that is right now lines of communication for data and information that our societies and our militaries rely on. But beyond that, that's all I've got. So thank you very much for having me. And I look forward to hearing everyone else and maybe answering a few questions.
Thanks, Brad. Fascinating look into space and cyber power theory. The one question before we move on, taking moderator's privilege. So do you believe that what you've identified as constituting from the writing on space power theory and cyber power theory, that something in there can be used to alleviate misunderstanding, misperception, or misjudgment such that we won't get to the point where we have a cyber war?
I'd like to hope that if we understand systems and we understand what's actually happening better, we're going to be able to communicate better, right? And be able to understand what is actually happening versus what we fear might be happening. And the one thing that I wasn't able to get into a lot is the maritime power aspect of it. I think if we assume that that maritime power might be a fairly decent, not a perfect analogy, but a fairly decent analogy, it actually might make space and cyber warfare not quite as frightening or escalatory, especially if you focus on reversible effects. Because it's pretty well known throughout military history that quasi wars tend to be Navy, maritime wars, and sure, pirating other people's merchant ships were bad, but it doesn't necessarily result in grand escalations in war, giant fights that kill millions of people. So maybe space and cyber attacks, as long as they're not as long as they're prescribed within attack and defensive lines of communication, aren't quite as bad as maybe some of us fear, and we can respond more rationally and as responsible people. So I'd like to think that we might have some insight, but that would require a heck of a lot more time than I've got now. So I hope that answered a little bit, but if not, I can try to talk offline about it. So
it did great.
Question.
Thank you. Thanks. And lots to unpack there. I think in the interest of time, we'll move on. Next, we're going to start to hear about some ongoing efforts at the international level to address this nexus of issues. Our next speaker is Elena Morizova, who's an expert in international space law and policy, also an expert in management of radio frequency spectrum and satellite orbits and satellite communications. She is the executive director of Sputnik, International Organization of Space Communications. She's responsible for their relations with member states as well as the UN system, and manages the International Legal Service. She also teaches space law and telecommunications law at St. Petersburg University and conducts research and publishes along those lines, and is, for our efforts today, I think one of the best people to be speaking on the issue, because she's a core expert and associate editor of the McGill Manual on International Law applicable to military uses of outer space, MIL-AMOS Manual. And with that, I'll turn it over to Elena.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this kind of introduction. Dear colleagues and friends, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, whichever place and time zone you are in. And let me join other speakers in thanking the organizers of this workshop for such a relevant and topical event. I think it was already mentioned for a couple of times that our discussion today is of great importance. And also, as previous speakers have already shown, we can see that operational domains of outer space and cyberspace are very much interrelated. But when we turn to discussing this relationship from the governance perspective, difficulties arises. And first of all, with regard to which exact regulation is applied. And the answer to this question will further suggest how to qualify and how to attribute certain conduct, and of course, what legal consequences will follow. And the main challenge, in my understanding, can be explained first by the difference in the very core of space and cyber regulations, and secondly, by the different level of their current development. So, for instance, space law provides a wide recognized and well-developed international regime, which consists both of so-called soft law and hard law, and is supplemented by a large number of national legislation. It is also known for being protective of what is called the freedom of the exploration and use of outer space, promoting these activities to be carried out for peaceful purposes. Also, very much attention is paid to what is called international cooperation, mutual assistance, due regard to the interest of other states. Also, space law is very much state-centric, including by, for instance, clearly imposing both responsibility and liability for the conduct of private actors to states. Space law provides those legal links which can put together objects or persons on the one hand and states on the other hand. So in almost any case, we can find a person or an entity who is in charge. As we know, in contrast to that, attributing space activities to states is a highly complex task, and both technically and legally. In general, we are only witnessing the emergence of regulation of cyber activities. For instance, the reports of the group of governmental experts on advancing responsible behavior in cyberspace can be helpful, but yet it is not the law. What is clear so far is the applicability of general international law to both cyber activities and space activities. This means that such operations must not, for instance, breach the due regard obligation, must not breach the obligation of respect to sovereignty of other states, must not breach the duty of non-intervention in internal affairs of other states, and of course the well-known principles of international law that such activities must not constitute a threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. But practical problems actually arise in determining what exact conduct would violate these obligations. And taking into account these regulatory features of the two different regimes, legal consequences of cyber operations can be completely different depending on whether they affect space activities or even represent themselves a kind of a space activities. And to address these legal challenges, several international expert projects have already been completed or are nearing their completion. I mean, first of all, the already mentioned Tallinn Manual, which describes international law applicable to cyber warfare and has a dedicated chapter on space law. I, of course, also mean other projects. The McGill Manual on International Law Applicable to Military Uses of Outer Space, which will be published by the end of this year. This manual articulates and clarifies the already existing norms governing military space activities during peacetime and during the periods of rising tensions. The other manual, which can also be published by the end of this year and which already also been mentioned, the Boomerang Manual, will focus on a similar topic, but from another angle. It will discuss these issues in the periods of hostilities. So this would be the difference. As a member of the Milamos team, I can share some details on just relevant rules. First, the Milamos manual contains a dedicated rule on cyber activities that constitute space activities. And as a brief summary, I can tell you that in such circumstances, the norms of the Outer Space Treaty and the other UN space treaties to which the relevant state is party will be applied to cyber activities, whether we like it or not, but all these norms will be triggered. Secondly, there is a set of rules dedicated to the radio frequency spectrum, which can be used in electronic attacks and can also become a kind of a link in a cyber attacks chain. The use of frequencies is rather well regulated on the already mentioned level of the International Telecommunication Union. This includes what is known as general prohibition on causing harmful interference, and that for both states and their private actors. I mean that the actors of these states under their jurisdiction. this prohibition, general prohibition, does not differentiate between intentional or unintentional harmful interference. And in practice, the vast majority of cases of harmful interference are unintentional, meaning that they are short-term and can be solved at the operator level, except those cases which also have already been mentioned and which represent a more political context. Among the well-known examples of causing harmful interference intentionally would be jamming and spoofing. They are usually of a longer duration. And to facilitate tracing the source of harmful interference, which can evidently be a challenge, ITU has established a satellite monitoring network system across the globe. And it can be an example on how third-party verification works in a complex technical situation and for providing the verified data. And such system used not only terrestrial but also space systems, a couple of them which have already been referred to during our conversation. Of course, it is much more difficult to deal with harmful interference when it is caused by the military. According to the ITU regime, states retain their entire freedom to what is called military radio installations. This exemption is explained of a very specific nature of national defense services, and the states are allowed to operate such service in not full compliance with the ITU regime. At the same time, it is believed that some states abuse this exemption, and the topic have already been discussed at the highest level of World Radio Communication conferences and will be discussed again later this year at the Plenipotentiary Conference. States try to interpret this exemption broader as not to cover only the military uses, but also to cover the broader notion of governmental uses. I do not expect any new regulation in this field because the topic is very much sensitive, so it is something that we must continue dealing with. But returning back to the Space Cyber Governance Project and its possible outcomes, all these manuals, they contain statements about what the existing international law is. They do not speak about how the law might evolve and which avenues it can take, but the Space Cyber Governance Project in turn aims to help determine what responsible space cyber behavior can be. And in doing so, my suggestion to the group of experts would be to focus on the legal side of this research. Though we have examples of the group of governmental experts on advancing responsible behavior in space, in cyberspace, and the open-ended working group on reducing space threats, also through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior. Recent discussions have shown that some states consider responsible behavior a political connotation, which can be used for political purposes. It would hence be very much helpful to place responsible behavior into legal contexts, such as, for instance, due diligence and due regard, and illustrate how different types of conduct would lead to or help avoid committing internationally wrongful acts, which is yet another legal concept, which is known to states. To put in different words, what kind of behavior is reasonable to expect in certain circumstances and why? And answering the last question, I would suggest to rely, of course, on court jurisprudence and state practice, which is not necessarily the same as the so-called best practices, which also receive different assessment. So I see that my time is running out and I should stop here. I thank you very much for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you and look forward to our further discussion.
Thank you, Elena, for a fantastic intervention. So many questions. In the interest of time, I'll move on, but there's thank you for hitting the points on breaking down silos and on making some recommendations for moving forward. It's very much appreciated. Our next speaker is Leticia Zarkan, who's a consultant and Unitier. She's also a doctoral researcher at Luxembourg University, specializing in space law and policy with a focus on security and safety, and also, luckily for us, looking at the nexus between space and cybersecurity. She's a visiting scholar at Leiden's International Institute of Air and Space Law, and has a number of master's degrees that are relevant, and she's extremely learned, and I'll let you look up her bio for more info. So Leticia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you very much to the organizers. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in the discussion very much, especially with the other panelists. Please note that I am not speaking on behalf of Unitier today, but only in my personal capacity. And I wanted to start with the fact that with the multiplication of space applications supporting military, civilian, governmental, humanitarian, economical activities, etc., and the reliance of said space technologies on information and communications infrastructure, it is crucial to tackle cyber issues, and more specifically, cyber technologies using software and network technique to compromise, control, interfere with, or incapacitate temporarily or permanently computer systems linked to satellite operations, because this is the issue at stake, right? And in the span of a few months, we've seen that cyber activities proved to have the potential to affect deeply space operations on a large scale. Space services, they are enabled today by payloads using digital systems to plan the space activities settings, telemetry logging, propulsion system, update of the software as well, or the monitoring of the internal parameters. So access to cyberspace can be plausibly denied, but also a hostile cyber activity can spread widely if we think about large constellations of satellites, for instance. And this spreading is sometimes quasi-instantaneous, and it can reach very important systems because we see more interconnected infrastructure. So overall, cyber means used as counter space capabilities are a very popular method of disruption. And I wanted to start with this fact because we often don't exactly know what is at stake when we are speaking about the nexus between space and cyber, but this is extremely important because it's not a future threat, it's a current threat, and also a past one because we've seen that it happened. And, you know, like such hostile cyber operations is a space threat. It has to be comprised inside the qualification of a space threat. And interestingly, space threats reduction is the very focus of the open-ended working group that is set to meet at the UN in Geneva at the Conference on Disarmament. So this working group has been established in December 2021 at the suggestion of the United Kingdom first, in the first committee of the United Nations General Assembly. The working group is a follow-up to the resolution 7536 titled Reducing Threats from Outer Space Through Norms, Standards, and Principles of Responsible Behavior. And most of us panelists right now, we are space lawyers. So this is pretty much what we are doing, thinking about norms, standards, and principles, but also conventions, treaties, and more binding instruments. So yes, this resolution on the point at end had been adopted in December 2020. And we must keep in mind that outer space is a shared domain where individual actions have collective consequences. It's kind of the same with cyberspace when the different systems are not segregated enough. In outer space, there is no segregation. Every single individual activity, if it's going well or if it's going, you know, like wrong, has a consequence because it occupies an orbit, you know, it's there and it is maneuvered among other different systems. And with the multiplication of emerging space nations and the increase in stakeholders, new economic and strategic issues are now integrated into the discussions. And this is a big evolution if we see like if we compared with the 60s when all the main treaties have been adopted. So during my presentation here, I will first address the mandates of the open-ended working group on space threats that I mentioned, and how the cybersecurity of space assets can be considered at the international level. Then I will discuss the importance, and this is open for discussion, of bridging to a certain extent space safety and space security, especially with regards to cyber activities. So to discuss a bit about what happened last month, so during the deliberations of the open-ended working group on the week of the 9th May, delegates emphasized the importance of the issue of kinetic ASATs and the creation of space debris through their use. This was, led by the recent declaration of the US Vice President Kamala Harris about who pledged not to carry out direct ascent ASAT test. And this is very interesting because this was highlighted as one of the primary concerns of states in their statements leading up to this UN meeting, collected in a report of the Secretary General published in July 2021. All of the documents are available publicly on the Office on Disarmament's website, and it's extremely interesting to see how different states have, of course, different approach with regards to what a space threat is and what could be remedies. So if this issue, I'm talking about the kinetic direct ascent ASATs, if this issue is a critical one because of its consequences for the other space activities, cyber hostile activities may be, as far as I'm concerned, considered as more threatening, or they could become a larger challenge in the coming years for a number of reasons. I mentioned a bit the large constellations of satellites. Can you imagine if one asset is targeted, cyber hostile operation is carried out, and then it just spreads through a large constellation of satellites, and it just incapacitates all of the propulsion capacities or this type of things? This is something that is very real, and this is why the question is extremely important. So as described by Rajagopalan from the Observer Research Foundation in the UNIDIR space dossier that was published on the topic, basic cyber capability is more easily accessible than other kinetic counter space capabilities. And this is why also it's extremely threatening. Cyber capabilities can be developed and deployed much faster than another type of ASAT technology, and also is much cheaper. The entry barrier for this technology is fairly low, with many independent hackers available. And we've, like during the previous discussions, there was this point on asymmetric warfare and this type of discussions, it's extremely, not easy, but cheaper and more accessible. And this is why we need to keep it in mind. So I believe that Dr. Guoyu Wang will address this, but the deniability factor and difficulty in attribution also makes cyber measures a perfect way to create massive disruptions and damage to space systems without real accountability, at least for now. So cyber warfare techniques directly attack data and the system that use data. The more satellites are linked to cyber nodes, the more vulnerable they are to cyber attacks. And as I mentioned, if you take a large constellation of satellites, each asset is produced in series and interconnected as a part of an entire system. And, this is also how we can see that a cyber hostile operation can qualify as a space threat. And in case of breach, a malware could spread across one, then two, then hundreds, and eventually thousands of satellites, And there are several points of intrusion for an attacker, including the landlines that are on the ground, that link all of the different stations to terrestrial networks, user terminals that link satellites, and antennas on satellites and ground stations. So therefore, not only the scale and effect of cyber activities can escalate quickly, but the targets are multiple, and therefore the key entry points. And all of these targets could be used to compromise a space activity or a mission. If you take space systems used to support humanitarian activities on the ground, or computers monitoring the life of astronauts, and if we manage to have settlements on celestial bodies, we will rely deeply on connected systems. The consequences, they can become dramatic. And the issue is that despite its gravity, the cyber threat tends to be set aside as an issue for later, because the perception we have of cyberspace is that threats are supposed to be too difficult to identify and to attribute, not so pressing, and perhaps too intricate to be considered as the current state of discussions. Nevertheless, it is a timely issue that should be considered as soon as possible at the multilateral level, because it is a twofold issue. On the layer of outer space, which include all the space infrastructure, systems of systems, assets, payloads that are maneuvering and are being operated in the space, in the same common domains, outer space. And we add to this the cyber layer that interconnects remotely these objects all together, with the risk of incapacitation that I mentioned earlier, or diversion of their initial purpose. So during the working group that was held last month on space threats, experts like Dr. Guoyu Wang underscored how electromagnetic or cyber warfare could qualify as an armed attack if states agree that the damage the cyber activity causes reaches a certain threshold of gravity. And we've seen recently some, some companies, Viasat, Starlink, they have been suffering from an interruption of service, temporary in both cases. But for instance, for Viasat, thousands of terminals apparently have been declared as being made out of service and had to be replaced, according to the French commander of space. So we can consider in this case that the cyber activities which cause such interruption of services are indeed, and I repeat, very important space threats. So the mandate of the open-ended working group, so, just to frame a bit, is to take stock of the existing international, legal, and other normative frameworks concerning threats arising from states' behaviors with respect to outer space. And therefore, because experts recognize that international law applies also to cyberspace, the delegates had to consider the relevant frameworks. And this is not only a legal, but also and mainly a political decision. As Elena Morizova mentioned, the frameworks applying to threats arising from states' behaviors with respect to outer space. So I will just wrap up very quickly. Overall, when we address the nexus of space and cyber activities, we kind of know that identifying an irresponsible behavior is challenging. And this is why we need to put together all the different aspects, all the different threats that we can identify, have every single stakeholder in the same room, private and public, and open the discussion to the different players that have, an interest. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Leticia. And in the interest of time, again, we're almost out of time, but Professor Dr. Wang, we certainly want to hear your comments on these issues. And so a very brief introduction. You are the Associate Professor, Dean of Academy of Air and Space Policy and Law at the Beijing Institute of Technology, as well as Deputy Director of CNSA Space Law Center, amongst many other accolades. And notably, you've served as the Chinese delegate to UNCOPUOS, as well as the IADC, and have also contributed to the Milamos project, which is, I think, very useful for our time today. So If you could please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charles, for the floor, and just good day to all. I thank for the very kind invitation, and I thank the previous speakers. I just learned a lot, and particularly Letitia just sharing some of my views, in the OEWG that meeting. So I'd like to just share with you my screen. I prepare a PowerPoint. I think that's the easy way to show how difficult it is, to define a responsible space cyber behavior. So just as Elena mentioned that, could you see, Charles, could you see the screen now? Okay, thank you. So Elena just mentioned that we have two different regulatory framework with respect to space activities and cyber activities. Okay, we know we have the space law. We're talking about space security, and we have general international law for the cyber security. But when talking about cyberspace or space cyber security, we just we have nothing. So that's the problem. So I would like to just take the attribution issue as an example to show the challenges and the difficulties, to define the line between the two legal systems. But before that, I would like to talk a little bit about the approach, responsible and irresponsible. So frankly speaking, I'm not convinced by this dichotomy. It happens that Elena just shared some similar views on that. So it's totally kind of political terms rather than a legal one, and it just has the political and cultural sensitiveness. It's very sensitive. So I heard the similar comments from the ambassador of Cuba and Chile, in May, to share the similar concerns about this approach. So inevitably, we might be facing some political, very subjective judgments. States members just blame to each other, no matter you're talking about the two camps, okay, Russia, China, or US and its allies. So that's the first point. The second point, from a legal perspective, I say it might change and undermine the spirit of law and its jurisprudential basis. What does it mean? Just as Elena mentioned, in general international law, we have the definition, the term internationally wrongful act. What does it mean? It means just some negative, legal consequences you are supposed to carry on. So that's the basis, for a country to consider before it just takes the action, no matter it's just space or cyber or space cyber one. So it has to consider about the legal consequences. So it includes like compensation, reparation, restitution anyway. But if we're talking about the responsible, irresponsible, it means that something more, some extra burdens there is from we say a moral or ethical, perspective, that's the judgment. So it means that no matter what kind of act you're taking would be deemed as an international wrongful act, you just owe apology to international community. So that's the point. So that's the line, the traditional line between moral things and law. And the last point is it might bring adverse impact to new space actors. I see the question raised in the chat is about the space debris mitigation guidelines. So it seems that the violation, or we say just the not consistent ways such kind of guidelines, would be deemed as irresponsible if just followed the dichotomy or the routine as it is now. So it's just again, it's how to say, it's not consistent ways that we say the non-legally binding nature. It just encourage people to do so, to catch up with the higher technical standards. But if you fail to do so, it does not mean irresponsible, right? Because we're in the different stages of the development in space technology or activities. The second point is that it's about the definition issue. It's super important. It's the precondition to talking about application of the legal system. So if suppose it is defined as a space behavior, we're talking about the 5 space treaties, in advance. It just prevails the application of general international law. But if it's defined as a cyber behavior, it just simply to mean space law does not apply. So then we are facing the first issue is about the definition. Since the time is very limited, I just to put as a conclusion here, I think when we're talking about space cybersecurity, actually we're facing about the behavior as a cause, but rather than the result. Always say the behaviors which would be affected by this cyber or space behavior. So I say the cyber operation to affect space activities. In this case, we consider the application of general international law. Okay, so that's the, I just gave more details about Milamo's rules. That's the definition about space activity. You can see, because we have the debates about if any activity which cause effects in space would be deemed as space activity. I'm just take the opposite position to that. I say that should be deemed still as cyber, like for instance, like cyber operation. It should not be deemed as a space activity. And we have another rule about cyber activity. Elena just mentioned that. It's clearly said cyber activity in some occurrence is just in support of space activity, some cyber operations. These operations could be deemed as space activity, and it means the application of space law. But it's different when we're talking about cyber interference or cyber attack. It is totally different. They are not supposed to support the space activity. It's to affect the space activity. So Elena also mentioned the some uncertainties of the application of the Lex Lata. So I say, of course, in the gray area, whether space law still applies in such kind of a gray area, no matter is named as military space activity or national security related activities. So we use different terms, like interference, attack, or armed conflict. Each word just means totally different legal system, right? We say general international law, the law of use of force, or the IHL, international humanitarian law. So the definition issue is the precondition. So now I just briefly give the attribution as an example. So the attribution on the space law, of course, is about Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. If you read the text, it's just established a broad, a general, we say the legal nexus between a non-governmental entity and the state, without specifically mentioning nationality or some other, the connections here. So it should be examined case by case. But in general, it's just a very still a low threshold comparing with the one set up in general international law. So according to we say the state's responsibility draft, or we say the articles, RCWA, attribution is a element to constitute internationally wrongful act. And it provides 8 occurrence, to define the attribution, just the link the behavior of individual or per sector with a state. So you can see I see it's a higher standard because it talk about like conduct of organs of a state, or conduct directed or controlled by a state, or the conduct of persons or entities exercising element of governmental authority. So I think it does not often, happen in, we say, the space cyber domain. No one would like to admit that they can conduct the cyber attack or interference just representing their responsible state. So it's just could be reflected in the Tallinn menu when talking about the attribution. It just pick several scenarios of the RCWA. It said that conducted by organs of state or persons or entities empowered by domestic law to exercise elements of governmental authority. Again, back to the space scenario, it's really hard to define, this situation. So briefly speaking, if one behavior is defined as a cyber one, it just means the application of a high standard under general international law. It means that the affected state is supposed to prove there's such kind of very close link, between the behavior and the state. But if it is defined as a space behavior, the affected state could claim that just due to the nationality link or the location link or the license link, the behavior of such kind of commercial space actors should be attributable to a certain state. So I just stop here. I see I already over the time, but thank you again for the attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Gayu. That was fantastic, and I think a perfect example. Well, maybe I'm told we can take an extra 5 minutes if we need, but I'd love to hear your opinion on it. Is this example of attribution evidence that we do need to break down these silos and have discussions on the space cyber nexus separate and distinct from what's happening in the fora that were discussed before, or not?
Are you asking me?
It doesn't, well, we can open it up to you as well, but I would think Professor Wang, if he wants to weigh in on that as well.
Thank you, Charles, but I'm just trying to close the sharing of the screen. Sure. but I will just follow your instruction anyway. Thank you.
Okay. Eitan, did you want to weigh in on that one before we close out the panel?
No.
Okay, terrific. Well, there are a bunch of very fascinating questions in the Q&A. One of them, I think in the interest of time, we can have I'll ask for the panelists to weigh in on those through answers, typed answers. And I will turn it back over to our organizer, Eitan. Thank you, everyone. Round of applause for our panelists. It was very, very informative. I regret we didn't have more time for Q&A, but if you have any questions, you can find my contact information online to the audience, send them to me and I'll distribute them and we'll try and get answers back to you all. And hopefully we can continue this discussion at some future time.
Thank you, Charles, and the panelists for this interesting panel discussion. And I would like more broadly to thank the moderators and all the panelists, and also all the participants that shared our time and discussions. Among my takeaways, my takeaway from this workshop is that the space cyber security and the resilience is already a real-life problem that we need to address, and also that there is room and the possibility to adopt an integrated discussion and governance responses. The workshop also demonstrated the importance of having a diverse group for example, in the notes of the panelists on using the term responsible behavior, which I think we might need to discuss this. Maybe we will need to adopt the title of our work going forward. So this is already contributing to our discussion. I would like to end by inviting everyone to visit the webpage of the Ostrom Space Governance Program and also the webpage of the Space Cyber Governance Project, and to contact Charles, Scott, or myself if you want to join this project. I will now share the links and emails in the chat box. And I think with that, we can close this workshop. Thank you, everyone, and I hope to continue our discussion going forward.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.